My name's Zachary Corser. I'm the research director of the Dreier Roundtable. And as you know, the conference title is Unpopular Politics. And thought we had a very interesting and revealing discussion about the dynamics of trade and economics. Today and later this morning, we're going to focus more directly on politics and how it is that there seems to be, not only within the United States, but globally, and we touched on this a little bit in talking about the EU, a political reaction, not only to free trade, but a lot of concepts and ideas that we have taken for granted for a number of years, involving political parties, involving elections, involving the way in which we see a kind of establishment being held up to ridicule and to derision by a growing unrest within our politics, both in the United States and in Europe. And part of our discussion here is, again, not going to talk just about the United States, but also to talk more generally about what's going on in the world. So I'll just begin introducing the panel. Maybe I should wait till he shows up, so I'll start with Professor Jack Pitney on my left. He hardly needs an introduction here at Claremont McKenna College, particularly to the students, but for those of you who are not familiar with Professor Pitney, he's a longtime professor of government here at Claremont McKenna College. He's the author, most recently, of The Politics of Autism. He teaches our Honors Government 20 class. He's won multiple teaching awards for his teaching. He runs our Congress class and the famous Congress simulation, which just finished up last night. He is integral in our Washington program, and he's very much a part of politics here at CMC. So we're very happy to have him here. I'm also joined by a former colleague and friend, Vincent Michelot. He teaches at Sciences Po Lyon. For those of you who don't know, Sciences Po is the Grandes Écoles for political science, the prestigious political science university in France. And Vincent is the former director of Sciences Po Lyon. He is a scholar of American politics, and he is going to offer us some perspectives on France, on Britain, and on Europe on this question of populism. And then just coming up to join us here on stage is former Secretary of Commerce, Mickey Kantor. Well, we really appreciate you coming today. As I said, he has a deep involvement in our American politics. He was Secretary of Commerce in 1996, 1997, appointed by President Bill Clinton. He was chairman of the Clinton-Gore 1992 campaign. He was also a U.S. trade representative. So he has a deep interest and knowledge about our politics, about commerce, about trade. In fact, I think that might be a good place to start as a transition between our panel on economics and our panel on politics, is to perform what I think they're calling on CNN and other news channels a fact check. It seems increasingly that this was a comment made by Brandy Hoffine, who's a graduate of CMC. She's now Deputy Press Secretary for President Obama, and she says one of the things that's made her job increasingly difficult is that both sides of the political divide not only seem to have differing opinions, they seem to be working from two different sets of facts. And so the concept of the fact check seems very important on cable news these days. So I wanted to start with a fact check of our own. And that has to do with America's track record on trade negotiation. One of our candidates for president, Donald Trump, has a pretty long history of maligning the U.S. when it comes to our ability to negotiate trade. In fact, in the last debate, Hillary Clinton brought up the point that he'd actually taken out a full-page ad in the late 1980s criticizing President Reagan on this very question. So he has a consistent track record. But let's have a fact check. I mean, from your experience and from your perspective, how successful do you think that the U.S. has been in negotiating trade agreements?
Successes in the... Is this on? Can you hear me? Is that okay? Good, good. Success is in the eyes of the beholder. There is no alternative to trade agreements. let me just pose this question. Does anyone think we're not going to have a globalized world over the next 50, 100, 200, 250? Of course not. Of course we're going to have it. Now, do you think we should have a globalized world without rules? Well, some people actually believe that. Donald Trump obviously believes that. No rules, unless the rules are totally in favor of the United States of America. I reminded people in trade negotiations, these are not conquered parties on the other side of the table. They're sovereign nations you're trying to negotiate with to make progress. Two things about are they successful? There is no perfect trade agreement. Even Jaime Sarapucci has never negotiated a perfect trade agreement. Do they need to be updated? Absolutely. Do we need to update NAFTA? Absolutely. It's 23 years old, folks. Look what's happened in 23 years. There was no internet. There was no cloud. There were no laptop computers. There were no iPhones. All the things we do today and need data transfer and data protection and intellectual property protection and protection of capital as it flows around the world, none of that existed when NAFTA was completed by Jaime, by myself, by Guillermo, when we did it. So what we need to look at is we need rules. The rules ought to be fair. The rules ought to level the playing field. They ought to be enforceable and enforced, but they ought to be updated continually. And what we haven't done, now let me criticize myself and my tenure. We reached trade agreements, we tried to enforce them, but we didn't recognize how fast the world was changing around us. I want to come back to that in another question about the world is changing and what creates where populism is today and so on. But you want to have a global world? We got it. You don't want to have rules? Then you're welcome to it, but it's a world that wouldn't work. So what we need is rules, and the only way to have rules is to have trade agreements. There is no other way. So you have trade agreements with other sovereign nations, you try to enforce them, you try to make them work. Sometimes you make mistakes. Sometimes they're not perfect. Sometimes they need to be updated. But you need to continually look at your world and create rules that can be enforced, or the world does not work in the way we want. And by the way, without rules, without IP protection, without data flow protection, without protecting capital flows, you would lose jobs, not gain them. Protectionism. All of you even I'm too young for this. In the early 30s, we passed something in the United States called the Smoot-Hawley Act. It protected the United States against outside flows of goods. Goods at that point, they wasn't capital and services. It was a killer. It led to exacerbating the recession in a way that was devastating for the U.S. and for the world. Well, President Roosevelt decided that didn't work very well, and a man from my home state of Tennessee, who was Secretary of State, decided they needed to go the opposite direction. Every administration, Republican or Democrat, where's David Dreier? Everyone, Republican or Democrat, has supported what? Right. I assume they were. I assume anything that devastating had to be. But that's a joke, folks. That's just a joke. I'm totally bipartisan. But every administration, I want to end with this, everyone since then in the United States has supported trade agreements. Not one president, Republican or Democrat, has ever not supported a trade agreement. And by the way, the United States of America has never rejected a trade agreement after it's been negotiated. And here we sit on the edge of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we're about to make a fatal, historic error.
There's been a lot of bipartisanship up here on the stage so far about trade. But it's obvious that trade has been an issue, a leading issue for Republican candidates for a long period of time until this election. There's so many black swans, I guess you could call them, this particular election. Things that we didn't anticipate, things that certainly Republican leaders didn't anticipate about the nomination of Donald Trump. So next question I wanted to hand over to you, Jack, and it's about this divergence that we've seen between a Republican nomination and Republican electorate that seems to have, in a very short period of time, turned against some very traditional bedrock establishment Republican issues like trade, but that trade's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot else going on there. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how it is that the Republican Party came to this pass where they nominate somebody who nominally seems to be a Republican and yet managed to power through I don't know how many different candidates on the Republican side for a nomination for the president to become the nominee of the GOP. What happened in that electorate? What's been going on that Republicans are now turning against free trade and other issues that we've always thought about as being a more sort of Republican stance on politics?
Well, if you look at the nomination contest, you mentioned the size of the field. That's an important element in itself. The normal people were split among other candidates, and that left an opening for somebody like Donald Trump. You can draw a comparison to 1964. Barry Goldwater came out from the outside, but the opposition to Goldwater was deeply divided. You had Nelson Rockefeller, Henry Cabot Lodge, William Scranton, Romney. In this case, it was George Romney, father of Mitt. And the anti-Goldwater forces were never able to coalesce. A second thing is that you do have, in particularly the Midwest and the Northeast, a large segment of the electorate that's deeply concerned about economic change. Those of you who've taken my Gov 20 are familiar with Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, in which you have a large segment of the electorate that has a sense of alienation from the political system, from the economic system. Now, Mr. Kantor's absolutely right. Protectionism is not the answer. But the question is a real one. What do we do about the economic distress of people in these communities? And that is a question to which Republicans have not had a particularly good and compelling answer, did not speak to the concerns of working class people. And those of you of a certain age may remember the old Billy Joel song, Allentown. I won't sing it. The factory's closing down and all the rest. And that left an opening for a snake oil salesman such as Donald Trump.
Mickey, if I wanted to, before we move on to talking about the European context, I want to talk a little bit about the Democratic nomination this go around. I mean, I think we've been very focused on Donald Trump, because of his antic campaigning, the things he said, just what an outlier he was to be nominated. But I think it's overshadowed to an extent the fact that Bernie Sanders, somebody who for his entire political career is not identified as a Democrat, has always steadfastly said that he was an independent. He sort of had to, of necessity, caucus with Democrats when he was in the House. Now that he's in the Senate. What was going on the Democratic side of the nomination process that he came so close to being a nominee for president for a party that he didn't belong to?
Do you have an hour and a half? No, let me. All of you have maybe better ideas than I do, but I think I have at least my own feelings about it. People are angry and anxious. The support for Bernie Sanders is not that different than the support for Donald Trump. Different kinds of people, different ideological base, but the same kind of anger, anxieties, concerns that they don't think are being addressed. And to some degree, they're correct. Let's not pat ourselves on the back too much. The fact is that here in the U.S., this is not, let me start, this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. In Austria, they nearly elected a Nazi. Look at the leader of the Philippines. Look what happened to the vote in Colombia after 50 years of war. They have a peace agreement, and they turn it down. Why is all this? Brexit, of course, is an obvious example of this. People are watching the world around them change in such a way they can't absorb it, And so they react with like most of the anger, anxiety, concern. And when that happens it manifests itself politically. And that's what's going on. Now, why don't we address it? Why have we? Neither political party in the United States has addressed it, has even begun to address it effectively. We're going to have to address it with education, not just the word education, but everything from technical training, which we're not doing, sadly not doing. We need a whole system of technical training in the United States, early childhood education. Our public schools are a mess. We all know it. We talk about it, and then we do nothing about it. So all these issues, the fact is that we have a major agenda in front of us, not only here in the U.S., but around the world, because this phenomenon is happening everywhere. What's fascinating is if it's happening in Asia, in the Philippines, and in Colombia, and with Brexit, and with Donald Trump, then we better wake up. We better begin to address it. Because what's happened is, who was the young man to ask about income inequality? I'm sorry, I only saw his back. Anyway, if he's not here, he probably got bored with us and left.
He's probably in class.
The fact is, income inequality is a fact, and it's going to become worse. And that's what part of globalization and technology does. And so we better begin to address it. I was talking to President Chertoff just a minute ago. We were talking about how many millions of jobs go wanting in the United States because we don't have the technical proficiency to fill those jobs. So something is missing here, some gap between the necessity and the answer. And neither party, as I said, is going to address it. The next president, which I guess many of us believe is going to be Hillary Clinton, has an enormous task, maybe insurmountable, to begin to close that gap and give people the confidence that both parties can come together and address these problems, and they're major problems. And by the way, folks, they have nothing to do with trade agreements. And what trade agreements have become is like the common cold. You know, you blame everything on them. Well, that's okay, but we better quit patting ourselves on the back, quit using that as a political tool, and get to the real issue. And by the way, I support Hillary Clinton, but I deeply disagree with her in what she's done and not leading on trade, which she should have. And by the way, I want to say this, and David, her husband in 1992, when we had to win Michigan and Ohio, came out for NAFTA, when it was deeply distrusted in Ohio because he thought it had to be done and had to be done. And people like David Dreier made it happen in the Congress.
Vincent, we're starting to talk about a more international context, and I made a little list here. It seems like Europe is a little ahead of the United States in right-wing populism, for sure. And I just made this little list here of some of the successes of right-wing populist parties in Europe, and it's getting very long. We've already talked about Austria and the fact that their Freedom Party candidate came in first in their presidential election, although that was disputed. The National Front in France came in first in regional elections at the end of last year. In Denmark, in June of last year, the People's Party came in second in parliamentary elections, another right-wing populist group. In Switzerland, in October, the People's Party there came in first in the parliamentary elections. Of course, we have UKIP, who's for a long time dominated the European Parliament for Britain and helped to lead to a successful Brexit vote. And then there's some on the left as well. We have a growing party in Spain right now, the Podemos Party. We have the Five Star Movement in Italy, who just took the mayoral race in Rome this summer. And of course, Greece and the Syriza Party. So there's a lot going on in Europe right now with right and left-wing populist movements. I guess a good place to start, because I don't know if all of our students are aware, you know, one of the oldest and most long-lived right-wing populist movements started in France, the National Front, the Front National. I wanted to, could you give us a little background on where they came from, and if you've seen some parallels between the National Front and what you've seen on the right-wing populism in the Republican Party in this election?
Yes, absolutely. The National Front, the Front National, is one of the oldest extreme right parties. in Europe. It actually started around the 1950s as an anti-tax shopkeepers movement, which was also very much in favor of Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco remaining as colonies of France, so they were pro-colonial. They were anti-European. All the people in that movement were against the Rome Treaty, and they evolved pretty much into a receptacle for all the angers and fears that the French experimented in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And those fears came with rural exodus, first of all, in the 1950s in France. They came with the place of the United States in Europe. The National Front has been violently anti-American and at the same time pro-American when it came to fighting communism. The National Front also, and its predecessors, were always very struck by the defects and the side problems associated with European integration, because they insisted on something which is very important, which is the fact that European integration has been essentially an economic project, much more than a political project. And so people fail to see the rights that come with the European integration. They can see maybe the benefits, and even though most people on the street fail to see the benefits, but they don't see the rights that come with that in terms of social rights, in terms of political rights. And more generally, I would say, the National Front is where people who have issues with the national narrative, the dominant national narrative of the time is. So that means that it's a very diversified, motley, hodgepodge, heterogeneous movement where you can see people with completely contradictory views. You have Catholic fundamentalists, and at the same time you have Aryan atheists within the movement. I've said already that they're pro-American and they're violently anti-American at the same time, which explains also for extremely flexible platforms. They've been pro-trade and anti-trade. They've been pro-welfare state, anti-welfare state. They have varied very much on the place of religion in the public sphere. And for example, the Front National has had, again, a very Catholic fundamentalist view, but today they claim that they're the principal defenders of la laïcité, which is our own version of the separation of church and state. So what most voters in the National Front or activists have in common is actually a sense of a loss of status in society. And they're people who are basically affected by downward mobility. So the main parallel with the Trump movement and earlier with the Tea Party movement is in the rhetoric. And it combines, first of all, protection against the evils of globalization. The second thing is scapegoatism. The Front National has always identified one enemy who needed to be fought. And the third point, which is characteristic of both the Trump movement and the Front National, is a completely dystopian, catastrophic view of the world blended with conspiracy theories, which you find on either side of the Atlantic. But at the same time, and I'd like to conclude on that, you have to be very prudent or careful with comparisons or parallelisms. First of all, there's an enormous difference between a GM worker in Michigan in the 1970s, the 1980s, or even the 1990s, and what a French steel worker or a Belgian steel automobile worker is. It's not the same status in society. And so we're not talking about the same impact of globalization on those two types of people. Historically, the extreme right in France, especially the National Front, is and remains an extreme right party. I'm not going to bring into the whole world of fascism, but it's an extreme right party, which sets it completely outside of the political mainstream with all the baggage, human and conceptual, which this entails. And finally, one of the reasons why the National Front is very different from the Trump or the Tea Party movements is that France has a very special relationship to Islam, and so it entails that the two movements are structured very differently.
France has, of course, had to endure some terrible terrorist attacks lately. And one thing that we haven't talked about so far that I think is a connection between the two countries and our two experiences about the rise, particularly of right-wing populism, is nationalism and the role of nationalism. I know that one of the slogans of the National Front is La France pour les Français, the France for the French, and a kind of reliance on a nationalism to exclude and to define, what it is to be French and how they want more of whatever that is and less of whatever is not in the country. Do you see a parallel with Donald Trump's campaign in the sense of a growing nationalism that you can see amongst Donald Trump supporters who are starting to think about, as we think about our politics, why don't we put America first? I mean, this is something that Trump has said. I think this is something that has resonated with voters. An America first agenda where we stop thinking about what's happening outside America and focus on what's happening here. Do you see a parallel there?
The first parallel is that I believe that nationalism and protectionism are the default mode when free trade doesn't deliver the benefits that it promises. So when, for example, European integration fails to concretely affect the lives of people when it comes to finding a job, and if you're a steel worker in the northeastern part of France, there's no moving to another part of even France, let alone another country within the European Union, then protectionism, nationalism have more appeal. And I really want to emphasize the fact that at this point, elected officials, politicians have an enormous responsibility. And for example, I kind of respectfully disagree with what Dalibor said, that Brexit was the French or the European version, I should say, of the Trump movement. Because in the United States, you have presidential elections every 4 years. And so the Republican Party had to choose a nominee, and you're having an election in 2 weeks. David Cameron did not have to organize a referendum on Brexit. And maybe he wanted to fix some problems within the Conservative Party and address certain types of issues. But I very much disagree, for example, with one of the candidates for the Conservative nomination in France right now, our ex-president Nicolas Sarkozy, who wants to resort massively to the referendum, notably on questions of immigration and on questions of public policy, because in times such as ours of populism and economic distress, the referendum is probably the worst public policy tool that you can ever imagine, and it's like throwing gas on a fire.
That's a very interesting point. We're here to talk about policy, but we're here also to talk about the institutions of political parties and how they play a role in the emergence of populism. And it's interesting to me, and I want to talk about Europe, and then we'll refer back to the US, because I think this has been a problem, certainly with our nominations process, is that as the public becomes more restive about politics, they're unhappy, they're looking for reasons why, they're looking for a solution, they're looking to have their voices represented, a common reaction to that amongst policymakers is more democracy, not less. That is to say, removing barriers between the government and the people and having a more direct relationship with the people. And Vincent, you just brought this up in the context of in Europe, Brexit was, of course, a referendum that was put up by David Cameron. The French political parties are now looking for nominees using a process that looks something like the American process. That is to say, they're asking people directly, who do you want our nominee to be? How much of the dynamics of the rise of populism is being not controlled or mediated, but rather exacerbated by too much democracy and not enough of what we might call republicanism?
Well, first of all, I think that the import of a primary system into our political system, which is the Fifth Republic, has been very damaging to the body politic, but at the same time, it was inevitable. There was no alternative mode of choosing the candidates for the main for the presidential election. At the same time, it's been a system that's been completely different from what you have here in the United States. It's almost jerry-rigged, imagined as we go, depending on the personality of candidates and the state of French politics at the present time. But there was no alternative in that respect. And I believe that we should not blame just the system, but more essentially, we should blame a certain number of choices that have been made by leading politicians to go back to the people on issues that should be dealt with by representatives in the parliament and not through the referendum system, which is, at this particular time, a tragic mistake.
Jack, I wanted to turn to you on a similar question, but in the American context about the Republican Party. So if we think back to 1968, that pivotal year for presidential nominations, where the fact that the delegates on the convention floor in Chicago for the Democratic Party nominated a president or a presidential candidate who had never entered one primary. And there was a strong reaction that this was very undemocratic and it was unfair by implication. We need more intra-party democracy. And the McGovern Commission is formed. 1972, of course, McGovern happens to be the nominee that year. But for the most part, the march of party nominations for president in Republican and Democratic parties, because of course the states are the one that decide, if we're going to have a direct primary or a caucus and these kinds of rules. It seems it's unavoidable that we have a very sort of plebiscitary, democratic primary process now in America on both sides, although the Democrats have instituted this superdelegate rule. How much of this highly democratic process do you think is to blame for the nomination of Donald Trump? And do you think that in January and after, there's going to be some deep thinking on the Republican side about maybe their own version of a superdelegate?
Well, if you had a system in which party leaders actually chose the nominee, that is, if you believe House of Cards, then Donald Trump would never have been the Republican nominee. However, I think a lot of Republicans who are looking longingly at the superdelegate process need to think carefully about how it actually works. The idea of superdelegates was that they would be a check and balance on the primary electorate and allow the party leaders and elected officials to have an element of peer review in presidential selection. Well, it's never really worked that way. The superdelegates in the Democratic Party have never reversed the will of primary voters. In particular, look at what happened in 2008. Initially, Hillary Clinton was the heavy favorite to win the Democratic nomination, and everybody expected all the superdelegates would side with her. Then Barack Obama started having unexpected success, and the polls showed that the electorate was moving in his direction. At that point, the superdelegates broke heavily for the outsider, broke heavily for Barack Obama, to the extent that you had some superdelegates, such as John Lewis of Georgia, who had previously endorsed Hillary Clinton, disendorsing her and flipping to Barack Obama. Why? Because they're politicians. John Lewis was very open about it. He said, I'm looking at what my constituents think, and I have to represent my constituents. So if we had a superdelegate system in the Republican Party, I suspect we would have seen something similar. A lot of them initially supporting another candidate, but as they saw the polls gradually drifting to Trump, I think a lot of them would have supported him anyway. So I think in the end, the Republican solution to Trump isn't procedural. I think it's a matter of policy. Somebody has to come up with a genuine set of policies to address the anxieties that gave rise to Trumpism, and do it in a way that's responsible, that's consistent with Republican tradition. But the idea of having some procedural fix, I don't think that's the solution.
Oh, I think we do need procedural fix or legal fix. I think it's pretty obvious. I would just disagree with you totally. If we could overthrow Citizens United, change the way we finance campaigns, change the way we organize people's access to the media, change the way in primaries we allow Iowa and New Hampshire to practically determine the next president of the United States. It's astounding. Why don't we have regional primaries? Why don't we have a New England primary, a Midwest primary, a Southern primary, and so on? So we can have a greater number of people with greater diversity and different demographics choosing in each party the party's nominee. There's nothing wrong with the people choosing the nominee. There's something wrong with allowing Iowa, which does not represent demographically the United States of America by any stretch of the imagination, nor does New Hampshire. It blows my mind. I've been doing this for too long. And every time I say the same thing, and every time, I don't do anything about it. No one does, because we're afraid of the politics of it. Well, it's time that we stood up to it, it's time we stood up, by the way, David, to a lot of things, both parties, and say enough is enough. And Citizens United, by the way, must be overturned. The way we finance elections is criminal, literally criminal, and we've got to stop it. And it does have an effect on the candidates. Anybody who says it doesn't is lying to you. It does have an effect, unfortunately, because it gives access to people who have interests with the government, and therefore they make their case. They don't bribe anybody. They don't have to. If you have access and you make a good enough case and you're a good enough advocate, you're going to get what you want. And that's what happens in life. And no one wants to tell the truth. So the truth is, we've got to change the way we finance, to change the way we do the primaries, and that would make a huge difference. Now, let me say one other thing, just as a footnote I think we all understand, which is in 2008, Hillary Clinton received more primary votes than Barack Obama, literally, more. Hillary Clinton graciously conceded for the good of not only the Democratic Party, but the country, to Barack Obama. No one's even said this on television anywhere else about the contrast that with what, or at least they have a little bit, with what Donald Trump has done or has said. I mean, we have got to, in America, come back together. We've got to have a little bit of grace and graciousness. We've got to care about the country, but we've got to change the rules. We've reformed over the years. It used to be, look, up until 1968 in the Democratic Party, it was a backroom deal to a great extent. There was no doubt about it. Estes Kefauver in 1952 won much more primaries than Adlai Stevenson. It made no difference. No difference. Hubert Humphrey in 68, the same thing. Dwight Eisenhower was brought in over Taft in the Republican Party because the bosses wanted him, thought he could win, and they were correct. So this is change. It's changed for the better, but we need to make more changes if we're going to really make it fair and responsive to the American public.
Now, I do disagree. Citizens United cannot explain what happened on the Republican side. The primary beneficiary of Citizens United, Jeb Bush. We all know what happened to Jeb Bush. Donald Trump, if you look at campaign spending, both super PAC and direct spending, way down the list. It wasn't, so that wasn't what happened on the Republican side.
Well, I'm for a free media, and I love the First Amendment. But what the media did, of course, is Donald Trump was great for ratings. And so Donald Trump, he just cut everybody else out of the news. And so for Republican primary voters, they only saw one candidate in the race, and therefore the rest couldn't compete with that. Jeb Bush couldn't, no one else could. That I can only explain because of, the media would take us 5 other conferences to try to figure out how to deal with the media in presidential and other campaigns. The fact is they were irresponsible. CNN has practically admitted it. CBS, Les Moonves said it directly. It was good for ratings. He loved it. He said it publicly. So the fact is that this was not only unusual, unprecedented in American politics, what happened, but it comes out of a base. I want to go back to what's been said of anger and anxiety, of change that people can't absorb, of an America that is like other countries of the world is in terms of the movement of people, the movement of technology, globalization is going to affect our lives. And what we haven't done is shown the leadership to talk with the American public and inform them and let them know how it's in their interest and what is in their interest. Politicians are frightened to death of it. They just won't do it. And so you see 2 candidates for president, both standing up and opposing TPP. First of all, neither one of them, I bet you, has read it. I guarantee you that. And number 2, both are just frightened of the politics of it. One is taking advantage, the other is just frightened of it, meaning Hillary. And so therefore, but let me just say this, she will get behind that big desk on January 20th, and I guarantee it, like every other president before her, everyone, she's going to say, ooh, this is important, it's got to be done. And so she's going to look at TPP, we'll make some changes, and we'll pass it.
Vincent, looks like you had a comment? No? Okay. It seems like we're just before the election. It's been a very long and difficult struggle for America with the nomination of Donald Trump and this very unusual election, and we talked about some things like the role of the media that's very complex, and we're going to be working through this. And I think in some ways we're sort of assuming that the election's almost over. Maybe it's just kind of a self-defense mechanism that we just want it to be over. Right. But we're already starting to think about reform and what comes after the election. So Mickey, I wanted to start talking about reform with you and talk about Hillary Clinton and the challenges that she faces within her party. Again, talking about populism, but on the left. I think it's probably hard to say that, once if she's elected and she's president, she gets inaugurated, that, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and other, people on the left in her party are just going to fall in line. What challenges is she going to face from her electorate and from people on the left in her party?
Oh, tremendous challenges. She'll be walking a tightrope. On one hand, she would like to reach out, I guarantee you, reach out to Republicans and independents and try to bring them in and try to make compromises and try to move some things forward like infrastructure, like tax reform, other things that people on both sides would like to see happen. On the other hand, she's got a whole constituency, as you have suggested, that are looking to her to provide leadership and everything from not free tuition, but subsidized tuition, or at least tuition loans that are guaranteed by the government in order to lower the cost for our students. everything to that, to how to deal with global warming, which is an existential threat. I think it's critical as nuclear proliferation, both of which don't get enough discussion in this campaign, obviously. The fact is that she's going to have to look to both the left and the center to try to build a coalition, which is going to be difficult. And I'm not sure how she does it. I think it's going to be a challenge that few presidents have faced. And you're right, if she falls too far one way or the other, she's not going to be able to move anything forward. We're going to find ourselves 4 years from now with the same kind of anxiety, anger, frustration, and lack of progress.
Vincent, I'm going to continue to work on some dangerous territory, trying to draw comparisons between France and the U.S. on this question of right-wing populism, because I want to start to think about what happens to the Republican Party after November. So the Front National, I think, has been a consistent pressure on the right in France, and I'm kind of curious how the UMP, who is the sort of party of the center-right, now they call themselves les Républicains, although that doesn't seem a very good branding right now, to call yourself the Republicans in France. How have they dealt with this pressure from the right, from the Front National? Has it made them more centrist? Has it pushed them more to the center, or has it actually pulled them the other direction?
Neither. Basically, the Front National has managed to increase the fragmentation within the Conservative Party in France. So, and it's very much in evidence right now with the 7 candidates who are running for the nomination of Les Républicains. It has divided the party over the place of religion. It has divided, in the public sphere, it has divided the party on the question of how far we can abandon a certain number of civil liberties in order to fight terrorism. For example, our ex-president has asked for a referendum in order to detain people who are suspected of terrorist implication, but they're simply under surveillance by the French police, but they have not been convicted of any crime, and our ex-president is proposing that we should have a referendum as to whether those people can be detained and interned without any kind of court intervening. So that's a major point. The third point is that it has also fragmented, divided the Conservative Party over the question of Europe, because it has increased the sovereignist movement within the Conservative Party, and it has been very, very toxic in as far as the European feeling within the right. So, and finally, just like the Tea Party movement and then the Trump movement in the US, it has broken a certain number of taboos. That is to say, there are things being said right now in campaign rhetoric that were never said before in traditional meetings. And I just want to give you one small example. The meetings of the Conservative Party, Les Républicains, traditionally end with people singing the national anthem, La Marseillaise. Well, now, especially in strongholds of the National Front, they do sing La Marseillaise, and then they sing something which is uncanny, extremely worrisome, alarming. They sing, On est chez nous, on est chez nous, on est chez nous. What does that mean? We are at home. And we are at home means we don't want immigrants. We don't want Muslims. We don't want people that do not look like us. And hearing in a conservative party rally something like "On est chez nous," we are at home, is profoundly disturbing. And that's the effect. But the Front National has not moved either parties, major parties, whether it's the Socialist Party or Les Républicains, to the right or to the left. It has just fragmented them. It has increased the lines of separation between various trends or currents within the party. And it has exacerbated divisions. But the fact is, and we'll come to that maybe later, but the fact is that the National Front does not have the ability to move either parties in one direction or another, simply because, again, it's a party which is outside of the mainstream. And I want to emphasize this very strongly. This is a party which has a collaborationist, fascist past, which cannot be considered as part of the political mainstream. And we do have institutions and rules in terms of running elections that make it impossible at the present time for the National Front to have any major role either in the Parliament or for Marine Le Pen to ever hope to be the next president. She is not the next president of France. And it will take probably another 20 years for the National Front to even be credible as a party which would produce a president.
Jack, it's interesting to listen to Vincent describe the Front National as breaking lots of taboos, that certain things are so beyond the pale that they suggest that it seems impossible that they could ever win the presidency, for example. In this last election, we seem to have broken a lot of taboos in our own politics on the Republican side. Things being said that we couldn't quite imagine, statements being taken and positions drawn by Donald Trump in particular that we could not have really imagined before, such as closing the borders to Muslims, for example, a kind of sexist rhetoric that we get from Donald Trump, things that we sort of seemed beyond the pale but now seem more commonplace. And I guess this is part of a larger question about the future of the Republican Party. I don't want to be histrionic or panic that the Republicans are going to dissolve, but they do seem to be in crisis. And there does seem to be a growing difference between, Trump voters, which, I don't know how big that number is. I know in California it's not very big. We just saw the other day that he's only polling 28% right now in California, but in other states he's doing much better. How do you see this as an existential threat, Donald Trump and this new rhetoric and these taboos and this sort of right-wing populism? How much is this an existential threat to the future of the GOP? And do you see the GOP fragmenting after this election?
Well, a couple of parts to that. One, you mentioned California. The Republican Party is in deep trouble in California. We have a state chairman who understands this, who knows exactly what the party needs to do by way of reaching out to Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, has worked overtime as much as he could. But when you have a downdraft from somebody like Trump, it's really hard to counteract that. And actually, for Republicans, the scariest number in that PPIC poll that you just mentioned isn't just that Trump is at a historically low level in California. He's going to get beaten worse than Barry Goldwater did in '64. But voters 18 to 34, Trump is at 13%. 13% in California. And that tracks with what I see here on campus. We still have a substantial number of Republican students. I don't know too many of them who are supporting Trump. So if that's a sign of the future, that's very problematic here in California. There's a very strong chance Democrats could get a supermajority in the state legislature in this election, which in turn would discourage Republican candidates from running in the future, and we could end up in California with something like the kind of one-party dominance that B.O. Key described in Southern politics. And I think ultimately, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, that's not healthy for the state. Nationwide, the only thing worse for the Republican Party than a Trump defeat would be a Trump victory. Because the stench of Donald Trump would linger much more deeply on the party for many years to come, and the party has enough problems as it is with growing segments of the electorate, and those problems would be much, much worse if he were actually elected. Now, as far as the possibility of a breakup, that I think is more remote, not because there's inherently great strength in the Republican Party right now. It's just the mechanics of setting up a third party or a minor party are extremely daunting. Ballot access rules, very difficult for third parties to make headway in the states, especially here in California, because the top two primaries essentially put third parties out of business. Campaign finance, very difficult for third parties. The only way you could do it would be if Trump made a deliberate decision to spend a large chunk of his wealth to try to establish a third party. That's what it takes. It takes the resources. Now, if he were willing to do that, then we might be having a different conversation. But if you look at the campaign finance reports, he hasn't spent nearly as much on this campaign, as he claimed. And in fact, a lot of it is going back into his own pocket because a lot of the campaign expenditures are to Donald Trump. His campaign headquarters in Trump Tower, he pays himself rent. So basically, if you're giving money to Donald Trump, he's actually putting that in his own pocket. So this does not sound like the founder of a third-party movement that he's trying to build something that will outlive him.
May I ask you a question on this, which also would have an application in Europe? Is besides all the factors that you've mentioned, there's also the fact, at least from the outside, that beyond Trump, who would be the leading figures of Trumpism? That is to say, and that's one of the problems, for example, that the National Front has in France, is that it has a narrow but extremely activist base, but without any ability to translate that activism into a form of informed and structured exercise of power within the existing rules of the system.
Let me just play on that. I'd like to hear from all of you. We're all in this together. It's a good small audience. We can talk to each other. How many believed if Donald Trump had not been a racist and a misogynist, in other words, only had been a somewhat nationalistic, but had been a protectionist in the way he is, that this race would be somewhat different now than it is? It frightens me. See, it frightens me to death. And I think that's what we ought to, look, Donald Trump has some problems emotionally. And we all know that. He's a supreme narcissist, and therefore he does things that are unacceptable to the great bulk of the American public, and we're going to see that happen. But he is doing much better than you would expect someone who has said what he said about women, about Muslims, about Latinos and Mexican Americans. What he has said is unacceptable, yet he's going to get 39, 40% of the vote, something like that, 41%, whatever he's going to get. He's not going to lose by more than 4 or 5 points, and that's a big victory in American politics, but that's pretty frightening. And that's because he is talking to an issue of nationalism and protectionism that Americans are buying to some degree because they're frightened and they're anxious and they're angry. And I think maybe we ought to spend some time. I'd love to hear from everybody else about what you think about that, because that's what bothers me. He's unacceptable as a human being, but what he is saying frightens me even more about those issues.
Mike Murphy, who ran Jeb Bush's campaign, has run other Republican campaigns in the past, said that he blames this election on Fred Trump, who should have hugged Donald more. So let's take some questions from the audience. We're going to bring some students over with microphones.
Yes, thank you all for being here today, and I just wanted to ask about whether you mentioned how these populist movements often manage to build bridges between deep ideological divisions. Like I heard Catholics and atheists united together at one point, and he also talked about the need for a President Hillary Clinton to unite the center and the left. And is there anything you think she can learn from how these populist movements bridge over their ideological differences?
In fact, yes, I think she can at least address it. I think she needs to lead. And now that's too easy to say, and everyone says people need to lead, but let me just explain that. She can't run away from the issues. She's got to address them directly. The American people have seen their society, and I'm just, excuse me for talking just about the U.S. right now, have seen a society change and sociologically, tremendous changes in our society. 10 years ago, if I'd told you, not you, you're young enough, you would have believed it, that gay marriage would be accepted all across the United States of America, you would have thought I was out of my mind. Just 10 years ago. Look at that sociological change. Look at the LGBT community and how the people are accepted as they should be now. Not so just 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Look what's happened to us just in the last few years in terms of race and color and immigration and absorbing people. We have done a pretty good job here. Let me give everyone credit for this in this country, but the change is frightening to people. They look around and say, these people don't look like me, as you said before. They don't look like me. This is not how I grew up. This doesn't look like this town I grew up in, Nashville, Tennessee, anymore, because Latinos, Hispanics, Asians, are all are the fastest growing populations in the United States of America. It's a great thing. It's our strength. It's a way we've grown over the years, but we've always had this reaction. Before we all panic too much, it's happened before. We've had riots and bombings and killings and right-wing movements and left-wing movements. Remember that all of you were in the history of the McNamara brothers in the early part of the 20th century and the reaction to what was going on in this country and labor being dissatisfied and the immigrants pouring into the United States. That's when my grandparents came here and during that period of time. So let's not panic. We've been through it before. Other countries have been through it, but it does exist. So let me go back to Hillary. She's going to have to talk to the country directly about it. You can't avoid it. You can't run away from it. She's going to have to say, let's just take what we're talking about, trade today. You have to say to the country, we're in a global world. We want rules. It's going to mean trade agreements. And I am going to lead the way, and we are going to do it together because it's good for us, not bad for us. We play by the rules generally in the United States, and some others don't. So we want to level the playing field. It's very simple, but she's got to do it. In this campaign, one candidate doesn't understand it, and the other one has run away from it. So starting on the 9th, literally on the 9th, she's going to have to start to bring the country together and talk directly to it and be honest with where we are and what we have to confront.
Thank you very much. This is a really wonderful conversation, so thanks to all of you. I just want to throw out two questions. One is, this is always very nuanced, but our other candidate, Hillary, is very flawed as well. And we have WikiLeaks coming out, and I think it's easy for her to come out and say, trust me, I know what's best for us. We're now going to come together. I'm just curious what you think about that, because more people here are probably more angst-ridden about that as well. So I'm just curious.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The question is, we have another
Okay, again, specific policies. What exactly are we going to do about economic inequality? And again, a lot of this, as Mr. Kantor pointed out, goes to education. Biggest gap, both economically and politically, is education. If you have a college degree, odds are you're probably going to do pretty well in this economy. Not perfect, but overall pretty well. No college degree, not so well. And those are the folks who are voting for Trump. So what do we do? What specific policies can we have to advance the economic standing of people without four-year college degrees? Something very specific she can emphasize, something I think that we desperately need in this country, community colleges. We vastly underinvest in community colleges. They're a tremendous resource for people who want to get technical skills but don't necessarily want to go on to a four-year degree. And so if Hillary Clinton were standing here and asking me what specific policy she could pursue, improve the status of community colleges.
So I wanted to make a comment, and maybe from the professors, Pitney and Corser, get a response. Professor Corser, you mentioned Mike Murphy, who we all know and like very much. I actually think that he and Jeb are the reason that we have Donald Trump. The reason for that is we have $140 million in the Right to Rise super PAC, and not a penny spent on opposition research. Not a penny spent on investigators, not a penny spent eliciting information like the Clintons have done in their campaign for more than a year. Dozens of people working, millions of dollars being spent to uncover and unearth dirt on Donald Trump, which now is making some difference in the campaign. But instead, Murphy spent $42 million trying to wipe out Marco Rubio. And none of the other candidates had a penny to spend on opposition research. So what they did was they said, oh, Donald Trump went broke, Donald Trump stiffed a contractor. Doesn't mean anything. You have to spend the money and do the work, and if Trump would have withstood that and still been the nominee, it's unlikely, but it would be a situation. But they spent all the money on media, television mostly, that was completely worthless.
Well, here I am put in the position of defending Mike, but I'll try, and I'll say this, a couple of things. One, I think if you want to talk about Citizens United disrupting our politics, I think this idea of creating a super PAC that can take unlimited funds but cannot coordinate its activities with a main presidential campaign is a mistake. And I think, to me, that was the biggest mistake, is creating this huge amount of money in a super PAC. I keep using this lame sci-fi analogy, but for those of you who like Star Trek, you take the saucer section and the engineering section, you divide them, so you've got two ships basically who can't talk to each other. You can send signals, these kinds of things. I think having Mike be more directly involved with Jeb and having those funds be better coordinated would have been an advantage for Jeb. But to talk about the strategy, I don't think the Bush campaign was alone in just not seeing Donald Trump as a threat. I think, Mike has said, and I've heard from Cruz's campaign chair as well, that they had no idea that Donald Trump would persist, that he would be the challenge, and they ended up, basically aiming their fire at each other and allowing Donald Trump to rise sort of uncriticized. And then the last part of this is that, Mike and others, they did the testing on Trump voters. They started throwing the horribles at the Trump voters, saying, who he was, what he did, do you know who this guy is? They don't care. They don't care. I think that's been consistently proved by the fact that he became the nominee. I mean, we may not have drilled down to the real dirt of Donald Trump, but it was pretty much on the surface. He's not an angel and he has a pretty dirty face. People knew that and they didn't care. I think because of a lot of things we've been talking about in terms of frustration in the Republican electorate at the so-called establishment. So I wouldn't blame the campaign chairs. I think I would blame them collectively for not seeing what it was about Donald Trump that voters really cared about, Republican primary voters in particular, and that is he was speaking to them and saying, you know what? I see that there's something wrong with you guys, and I'm going to focus on it. He provides a kind of leadership, Donald Trump, a very bad one. I think he leads us to some pretty dark corners. But he is providing leadership where really there was none on this issue of what's going on in the middle of the country, with these white voters in particular who don't have college educations. When are we going to talk to these people and at least acknowledge their problems? So that's what I would say about that.
If I may, there's an interesting point to be made here, which is valid for both Europe and the United States, is that I think we've largely underestimated the degree of complete separation and detachment of populist voters, both in Europe and in the United States, from the mainstream parties. Most voters of the Front National in France are not even receptive to any kind of traditional political rhetoric, whether it's about rights, whether it's about economic benefits of trade, whether it's about the necessity of a European policy, of a foreign European policy, which we don't really have for the time being. Those voters are now so totally detached from traditional normative politics that the parties, the traditional parties, the government parties as we call them in Europe, need to find another approach to that. And there has been a lot of scholarship recently on the responsibility, for example, in Europe, of center-left parties in creating that vacuum in which extreme right parties have surged, literally. But I do very much believe in your point that those voters can no longer be reached through traditional means. And in France, for example, there was a debate as to whether this was just a protest vote and that those voters would come back into the fold at one point, and this has we've gone way beyond that.
Jack, last word to you.
Okay, unique challenge for opposition. I speak as an old Oppo guy. Unique challenge for Trump is that it's not just votes and quotes. To do Oppo on Trump, you need not only knowledge of policy, but the ability to read corporate documents, to really drill down into the economics and financials, and understanding legal documents. You know who's uniquely qualified to do all that? CMC students. So next time out, hire CMC students as Oppo guys.
We've got to stop now. Let me explain what's going to happen. Our Athenaeum workers are going to set up this room for lunch, so we're going to need to take a break. So I'm going to thank the panel. We'll have some applause, I hope. And then as soon as you can, and I want to extend my thanks too. I think this was a really interesting discussion. I don't want to chase you guys out, but if you could move your conversations out into the lobby so we could have our students set up for lunch, that'll make this whole process work easier. So thank you again for your attention, and thanks for coming.